Marcus Chen hadn't looked up from his phone in 3 blocks. The quarterly reports were a disaster, and the board meeting in 40 minutes would determine whether his 5-year plan survived or died in a conference room overlooking the financial district. His thumb scrolled through projections and revenue streams while his legs moved on autopilot through the downtown Seattle morning rush, his $1,000 shoes clicking against wet pavement still dark from last night's rain. The collision happened at the intersection of 5th and Pike, right outside the coffee shop where he'd just grabbed his usual triple espresso, and for a split second before impact, he registered movement in his peripheral vision, but his brain was 3 steps behind his body. The coffee went everywhere, hot liquid splashed across his tailored shirt, and the woman stumbled backward with a startled cry that cut through the morning traffic noise like a knife. Marcus looked up, ready to snap at whoever had walked into his path, and the words died in his throat. Sarah, his ex-wife Sarah, stood 5 feet away with coffee dripping down her worn jacket, her face drained of color like she'd seen a ghost, and clutching the fabric of her jeans were 2 small hands belonging to 2 small children who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Marcus felt the sidewalk tilt beneath him. The girl had his eyes, not similar eyes or eyes that maybe resembled his in certain lighting, but his exact eyes, that unusual amber green that his grandmother used to call tiger eyes, set in a small round face framed by dark hair. The boy was harder to see because he'd buried his face against Sarah's leg, but what Marcus could make out sent ice water through his veins. Same nose, same chin, same build even at that age. His mouth opened but no sound came out, and Sarah was already backing away, her hands moving to the children's shoulders with protective urgency that told him everything and nothing at the same time. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the divorce. 5 years since she'd told him she couldn't live with a man who valued board meetings over birthdays and merger negotiations over marriage counseling. 5 years since she'd walked out of their penthouse apartment with 2 suitcases and a lawyer's number. Marcus had thrown himself into work after that, built Chen Technologies from a promising startup into a tech giant worth $3 billion, convinced himself the emptiness in his chest was just the natural cost of success. But those children with his face staring up at Sarah, like she was their entire world. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the concrete. People were staring now, the morning crowd forming a loose circle around the collision scene like spectators at an accident, and Sarah's face had gone from shocked white to determined red. She bent down and scooped up both children with surprising strength for someone so small, one on each hip despite them being far too big for that, and Marcus watched his own eyes look back at him from 2 small faces before Sarah turned and pushed through the crowd. He stood there frozen while his brain tried to process what his eyes had just seen. Twins. Sarah had twins. Twins who were approximately 4 years old, which meant they'd been conceived 5 years ago, which meant they'd been conceived right before the divorce. His hand went to his phone automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 business crises, but this wasn't a problem he could solve with a conference call or a strategic acquisition. This was his life, his children, possibly, probably, definitely based on those faces. Marcus stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the brick wall of the coffee shop and the morning rush flowed around him like water around a stone. A woman asked if he was okay. He didn't answer. His mind was already racing through possibilities and timelines and questions that had no good answers. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept them secret for 4 years? What else had she been hiding? The board meeting was in 37 minutes and Marcus Chen had just discovered he might be a father. The board meeting was a blur. Marcus sat at the head of the table in the glass-walled conference room and watched his CFO present the quarterly numbers, while his brain replayed the collision on an endless loop. Those eyes, that face, the way Sarah had looked at him with something close to panic before running. Jennifer Watkins, his VP of Operations, asked him a direct question about the Singapore expansion, and he heard himself answer with words that apparently made sense because the meeting continued without incident. But inside his head, Marcus was already making plans. At 3 p.m. he called his personal assistant. Linda had worked for him for 7 years and knew better than to ask questions when he used that particular tone of voice. He gave her an address he'd memorized from the divorce papers, an apartment building in the university district that Sarah had listed as her forwarding address, and told her he needed complete background on Sarah Chen, formerly Sarah Mitchell, including employment history, financial records, medical records if possible, and any public records related to children. Linda's pause lasted exactly 2 seconds before she said she'd have preliminary information by end of business. Marcus trusted Linda because she was frighteningly efficient and completely discreet. At 6 p.m. he was sitting in his Mercedes across the street from a tired-looking brick building with a Vietnamese restaurant on the ground floor and apartments above. The address from the divorce papers was 5 years old, but something told him Sarah hadn't moved far. She'd grown up in this neighborhood, had talked about its coffee shops and bookstores with the kind of nostalgia people reserved for places that felt like home. His phone buzzed. Linda had delivered. Sarah Chen was employed as a medical billing specialist at Swedish hospital, working 40 hours a week at $19 an hour. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the building Marcus was currently watching. She had no significant assets, no car registered in her name, no criminal record, no marriage license or divorce filings after their own, and according to the county registrar, she had filed birth certificates for twins named Emma and James Chen, born 4 years and 7 months ago. Marcus read that line 3 times. Chen. She'd given them his name, but never told him they existed. His hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The anger was unexpected and enormous, a hot ball of rage in his chest that made it hard to breathe. She'd had his children and kept them secret for over 4 years. 4 years of birthdays and first words and first steps and everything else parents were supposed to experience together. 4 years of him thinking he was alone, while somewhere across the city, his DNA was walking around in 2 small bodies. Movement in a 3rd-floor window caught his eye. Sarah appeared carrying a laundry basket, her profile visible for just a moment before she disappeared deeper into the apartment. Marcus grabbed his phone and pulled up the private investigator he kept on retainer for corporate espionage cases. Victor Reeves answered on the 2nd ring with his usual clipped greeting. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He needed surveillance on Sarah Chen. He needed to know her routine, where she went, who she talked to, whether anyone else was involved in the children's lives. He needed to know everything. Victor asked if this was corporate or personal. Marcus said personal. Victor's rate doubled. Marcus didn't care. He authorized whatever expenses were necessary, and then sat in the dark car watching that 3rd-floor window like it held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The restaurant below, Sarah's apartment filled with dinner customers, warm light and cooking smells spilling onto the street. Marcus realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast, realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a real meal instead of protein bars between meetings, realized his entire life was conference rooms and quarterly reports and strategic planning sessions that now felt completely meaningless compared to the fact that somewhere above a Vietnamese restaurant, his children were probably eating dinner. His children, the words felt foreign. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years building an empire. He'd negotiated deals in 5 languages and closed acquisitions worth hundreds of millions. He'd been featured in Forbes and Fortune. He'd given a TED Talk on innovation that had 7 million views. But fatherhood, that was a country he'd never expected to visit. Victor's first report arrived at 7 a.m. the next morning. Sarah's routine was depressingly predictable. She woke at 5:30, got the twins ready for preschool by 6:15, dropped them at Little Learners Academy 3 blocks from her apartment by 7, took the bus to Swedish hospital by 7:30, worked until 4, picked up the twins by 4:45, made dinner, supervised homework, gave baths, read stories, lights out by 8, no social life, no dates, no friends visiting the apartment. On Saturdays, she took the twins to the University District Farmers Market and the library. On Sundays they went to a small park near Green Lake. She bought groceries at the discount chain store. She cut coupons. She wore the same 4 outfits in rotation. Marcus read the report 3 times, trying to reconcile this exhausted single mother with the Sarah he remembered. The Sarah from their marriage had been vibrant and creative, always dragging him to art galleries and indie film festivals, always laughing at things he didn't find funny, always trying to get him to slow down and appreciate the moment. This Sarah looked hollowed out, worn thin, like she was running on fumes and determination, By the end of the week, Marcus had established his own surveillance routine. He told his executive team he was working on a special project and cleared his schedule of anything that couldn't be handled remotely. Then he spent his days following Sarah and the twins at a careful distance, watching them live a life he should have been part of. Thursday afternoon, he watched Emma fall off a swing at the park near their apartment. She went down hard on her knee, and the wail that erupted from her small body made Marcus instinctively reach for his car door handle. But Sarah was already there, scooping Emma up and examining the scrape with practiced efficiency, producing a band-aid from her bag like a magic trick and kissing the injury better, while James patted his sister's back with solemn concern. Marcus watched Emma's tears dry almost instantly, watched her squirm down from Sarah's arms and run back to the swings like nothing had happened, and felt something crack open in his chest. He should have been the one with band-aids in his pocket, should have been the one kissing scraped knee, should have known his daughter was brave enough to get right back on the swing after falling. Friday evening, he followed them to a pizza place near the university. It was the kind of cheap family restaurant with sticky tables and arcade games in the corner, nothing like the Michelin-starred establishments Marcus usually frequented, but the twins' faces lit up like Christmas when Sarah pulled open the door. Marcus watched through the window as they demolished a large pepperoni pizza and played skee-ball with quarters. Sarah counted out carefully from her wallet. Emma won 17 tickets. James won 23. They pooled their winnings and bought a small stuffed dinosaur from the prize counter that they immediately started arguing over, until Sarah negotiated a custody-sharing agreement with the diplomatic skill of a UN peacekeeper. Marcus felt like a ghost watching scenes from a life that should have been his. That night, Victor called with information Marcus hadn't asked for but apparently needed to know. Sarah's financial situation was precarious. She was 2 months behind on rent. Her credit cards were maxed out. She'd taken out a high-interest personal loan 6 months ago that was now in collections. Medical bills from the twins' birth still haunted her credit report. She made $19 an hour and spent 18 of it on rent and childcare and keeping 2 growing children fed and clothed. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Victor asked if Marcus wanted him to keep digging. Marcus said yes, said he wanted to know everything about the last 5 years, wanted to know how she'd managed pregnancy and infant twins alone, wanted to know why she'd never reached out for help, wanted to know why she'd chosen poverty, and struggle over telling him he had children. The questions multiplied like viruses. That weekend, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He called his mother. Marcus Chen lived in a retirement community in San Diego and spent her days playing mahjong and judging his life choices. They talked maybe twice a year on holidays and her birthday, but she'd always wanted grandchildren. Had made pointed comments about Marcus wasting his prime childbearing years on quarterly earnings reports. When he told her about the twins, her silence lasted so long he thought the call had dropped. Catherine Chen arrived in Seattle 36 hours after Marcus called her. He picked her up from the airport in stunned silence, still processing the fact that his 72-year-old mother had booked a flight within minutes of hearing about the twins and packed a suitcase like she was preparing for a siege. She waited until they were back at his penthouse before unleashing her thoughts. Marcus had forgotten how terrifying his mother could be when she decided to deploy her full arsenal of disappointment. She stood in his living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture, and looked at him like he was 10 years old again, and had just failed a math test. "You have children," she said, her accent thickening the way it always did when she was emotional, "and you didn't know about them because you were too busy making money to notice your own wife was pregnant." Marcus tried to explain that Sarah had left before telling him that this wasn't his fault, that he'd been blindsided. His mother's expression suggested she was unimpressed with his excuses. She sat down on his $8,000 Italian leather sofa and folded her hands in her lap with the careful precision of someone preparing to deliver a lecture. Then she asked the question Marcus had been avoiding. "Why do you think she didn't tell you?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus paced to the windows and stared out at the Seattle skyline without seeing it. He'd spent a week running surveillance and gathering information and building a case against Sarah in his head, but he hadn't actually examined his own role in this disaster. His mother waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of her most devastating weapons. Finally, Marcus turned and said what he'd been thinking since the collision on 5th and Pike. "She kept them from me out of spite. She wanted to punish me for the divorce. His mother's laugh was sharp and bitter. You think a woman works 40 hours a week at $19 an hour while raising twins alone because she wants to punish someone? You think she struggles to pay rent and buys day-old bread because she's trying to hurt you? Marcus, you were always smart about business, but you're a fool about people. The words hit like a slap. Catherine stood and walked to the windows, her small frame somehow commanding the entire room. She told him about his own birth, about how his father had worked 80-hour weeks building the restaurant business that eventually failed, about how she'd raised Marcus essentially alone while his father chased success that never came. She told him about the loneliness of being married to someone whose mind was always somewhere else, about the exhaustion of being the only parent in a two-parent household, about the slow death of love when one person gives everything and the other gives nothing but money. You were becoming your father, she said quietly, and Sarah saw it. She saw the future where she raised children alone while you worked yourself to death for money you'd never spend. So she left before you could break her completely. Marcus wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. His mother continued with relentless precision. She asked him about the last year of his marriage, asked him how many dinners he'd missed, how many conversations he'd cut short to take work calls, how many times Sarah had tried to tell him she was unhappy and he'd promised to change later, after this deal, after this quarter, after this crisis that was always followed by another crisis. Marcus sank into a chair, feeling the full weight of his mother's accusations, because they weren't accusations at all, they were facts. He had missed dinners, had taken calls during date nights, had worked through their anniversary and her birthday and Valentine's Day, had made promises he never kept because the next crisis always seemed more important than the woman sitting across from him asking for scraps of his attention. Catherine's expression softened slightly. She sat beside him and took his hand with surprising gentleness. Now you have a choice, she said. You can be angry at Sarah for keeping this secret. You can hire lawyers and fight for custody and make everyone miserable, or you can ask yourself why she was so afraid to tell you. Ask yourself what kind of father you would have been 5 years ago. Then ask yourself what kind of father you want to be now. Marcus stared at their joined hands. His mother's fingers were thin and spotted with age, but still strong. Marcus spent 3 days planning his approach like it was a hostile takeover. He drafted speeches, rehearsed conversations, prepared for every possible reaction Sarah might have. Then, his mother told him he was being an idiot, and handed him $200 cash with instructions to buy groceries and show up at Sarah's apartment like a normal person, asking for a chance to talk. So on Tuesday evening, Marcus Chen, worth $3 billion, stood outside a tired brick building in the university district holding 4 bags of groceries from the expensive organic market and a bag of toys he'd spent 2 hours selecting at a children's store where the staff had looked at him like he was lost. He probably was. The building's front door was unlocked, which seemed like a security hazard. Marcus made a mental note to mention later. If there was a later, he climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled like cooking spices and old carpet, and stood outside apartment 3C, listening to small voices inside arguing about something involving dinosaurs. His hand was raised to knock when the door swung open. Sarah stood in the doorway wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and the color drained from her face so fast, Marcus actually stepped forward thinking she might faint. The twins appeared behind her legs like small guards, Emma clutching a stuffed dinosaur and James holding what appeared to be a wooden sword. They stared at Marcus with those amber-green eyes, and he felt his carefully rehearsed speech evaporate like morning fog. Sarah found her voice first. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation and a prayer and a curse all wrapped together. Marcus looked at her and saw the woman he'd married a lifetime ago, buried under exhaustion and fear. He lifted the grocery bags slightly. "I bought too much food," he said, which was possibly the worst opening line in the history of opening lines. "Can we talk?" Sarah's hands moved to the twins' shoulders in that protective gesture he'd seen in the coffee shop collision. Her face cycled through emotions too fast for Marcus to track. Anger, fear, something that might have been hope before she crushed it. The silence stretched until Emma piped up with perfect 4-year-old timing. "Mama, who's that man? Why does he have groceries?" Sarah's eyes closed for a brief moment and Marcus watched her make a decision he couldn't read. She stepped back from the doorway. 5 minutes, she said. The kids need to eat and then it's bath time. Don't think you can just show up here with organic kale and fix 5 years. Marcus stepped into the apartment and tried not to stare. The space was tiny and cluttered with the chaos of small children, but it was also warm and lived in with art on the walls and books everywhere and a blanket fort in the corner that suggested Sarah was doing her best to make this place a home. The twins followed him to the kitchen with open curiosity. Emma informed him that they were having spaghetti for dinner, and also they had a pet fish named Captain Bubbles who lived in a bowl by the window. James asked if the wooden sword was cool and could he have another one. Sarah told them to go wash hands with the exhausted authority of someone who'd said those words 1,000 times. Then she turned to Marcus and crossed her arms. Talk, she said. Marcus set the groceries on the counter and looked at the woman who'd walked out of his life 5 years ago. He thought about his mother's questions, thought about Victor's surveillance reports, thought about Emma falling off the swing and Sarah kissing it better without anyone there to help. Then he abandoned his planned speech and said the only thing that mattered. I saw them, Sarah. I saw Emma and James, and I've spent a week watching you raise our children alone while working yourself to exhaustion. I know you're behind on rent. I know you're drowning in debt. I know you've been doing this by yourself for over 4 years and I need to know why you didn't tell me. Sarah's face hardened into something like stone. She moved to the sink and started unpacking the groceries with sharp, efficient movements that suggested she was fighting the urge to throw something at his head. Sarah didn't turn around when she finally spoke. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks before I left you, she said to the groceries she was mechanically putting away. I took the test on a Tuesday morning after you'd already left for an emergency breakfast meeting in San Francisco. I sat on the bathroom floor for an hour, staring at 2 pink lines, trying to figure out how to tell you. Then I thought about what telling you would mean. Marcus opened his mouth, but Sarah kept talking with the momentum of someone who'd been holding words inside for years. I thought about how you'd react, how you'd probably be surprised and maybe even happy for about 5 minutes before your brain shifted into planning mode. You'd start calculating costs and logistics and how to fit children into your 5-year strategic plan. You'd probably hire a nanny and a night nurse and whatever other staff you needed, so that fatherhood wouldn't interfere with your real priority, which was always work. Her hands stilled on a bag of oranges. I thought about raising babies in that penthouse with its white furniture and sharp corners, and you coming home at midnight smelling like conference rooms. I thought about being alone with crying infants while you traveled to Tokyo and Berlin and Singapore. I thought about our children growing up thinking love meant expensive gifts delivered by assistants because Dad was too busy to show up in person. Marcus felt each word like a physical blow. Sarah turned to face him and her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. So I made a choice. I thought about telling you and fighting for custody and probably losing because you could afford better lawyers. I thought about watching you be a mediocre part-time father who showed up for birthdays and Christmas and made my babies feel like obligations on your calendar, or I could build a life where my children would never wonder why their father valued board meetings more than them, could struggle and be poor and work myself to exhaustion, but at least they'd have one parent who was present and available and actually there. The words hung in the small kitchen like accusations. Marcus struggled to breathe around the tightness in his chest. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she'd been wrong about him, but his mother's voice echoed in his head asking what kind of father he would have been 5 years ago. Sarah wiped her eyes with angry motions. I know what you're thinking, that I was selfish, that I stole your children, that I had no right to make that decision alone. And you're right, I did steal them. I looked at you and looked at them, and decided they deserved better than a father who would treat them like another acquisition to be managed by competent staff. Emma's voice drifted from the living room asking James if the grocery man was going to stay for spaghetti. Sarah's expression crumbled slightly. They don't even know you're their father. They think you're just some rich man who showed up with organic produce. How do I tell them? How do I explain that their dad is a stranger who's been 10 miles away for their entire life? Marcus finally found his voice. You could have given me a chance to be better. Sarah laughed and it was a broken sound. I gave you 1,000 chances, Marcus. Every dinner I ate alone.
Every conversation you cut short for work call. Every time I told you I was unhappy and you promised things would change after the next deal. I gave you our entire marriage to be present and you chose your company every single time. She moved to the small dining table and sank into a chair like her strings had been cut. When I left, I was so angry at you, angry that you'd made me feel like I was asking too much, wanting my husband to occasionally be home, angry that you acted like my feelings were unreasonable, when all I wanted was to matter more than quarterly earnings. But mostly I was angry at myself for staying as long as I did, for believing you'd change, for thinking love was enough. Marcus sat across from her. The apartment was quiet except for the twins playing in the other room. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, for the first time since the divorce, and saw the toll 5 years had taken, the exhaustion in her eyes, the premature lines around her mouth, the way her hands trembled slightly like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate, but necessary. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you weren't important. I'm sorry I chose work over you. I'm sorry I gave you reasons to think I'd be a terrible father."
Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway holding Captain Bubbles' fishbowl with both hands. "The man can stay for dinner if he wants, but he has to meet Captain Bubbles first, because that's the rule," she announced with the absolute certainty of someone who'd clearly just invented this rule. Sarah looked at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He should go," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "The twins need routine, and you showing up is already going to mean an hour of questions at bedtime." James joined his sister carrying the wooden sword. "Can he meet Captain Bubbles, though? The fish likes visitors." Sarah closed her eyes briefly in the universal expression of parents everywhere, recognizing they'd already lost this battle. Marcus looked at the twins and felt something shift in his chest. His children were asking him to meet their fish. It was such a small, ordinary thing, but it felt monumentally important. "I'd love to meet Captain Bubbles," he heard himself say. Emma's face lit up with a smile that reminded Marcus painfully of Sarah before everything went wrong. She carefully set the fishbowl on the coffee table and launched into an elaborate explanation of Captain Bubbles' backstory, which apparently involved being rescued from a carnival, surviving a tank cleaning incident, and having preferences about the music they played. James added corrections and elaborations while Marcus listened with the focus he usually reserved for merger negotiations. Captain Bubbles was orange and approximately 2 inches long, and completely oblivious to his role in this moment. After the fish introduction, Emma decided Marcus needed to see their room. Sarah started to protest, but Marcus was already being towed down a short hallway into a space that held bunk beds, overflowing toy boxes and walls covered in crayon drawings. Emma's bed was the top bunk and featured 17 stuffed animals arranged in what she explained was strict hierarchical order. James's bottom bunk had a fortress of pillows and a fleet of toy cars. "This is where we live," Emma said with pride. "We share even though sometimes James takes my things." James protested and a small argument erupted. Marcus watched Sarah materialize in the doorway and mediate with practiced efficiency. He realized she'd been doing this alone for 4 years. Every bedtime, every argument, every scraped knee and nightmare, and sick day. The weight of it pressed down on him. Dinner was spaghetti with marinara sauce from a jar and garlic bread that was slightly burnt. The twins talked non-stop about their day at preschool, their teacher Miss Rebecca, their friend Jackson who could already read chapter books, and whether dinosaurs were cooler than dragons, which was apparently an ongoing debate. Marcus sat at the small table in Sarah's kitchen and experienced something he'd never expected: family dinner. The kind of ordinary, chaotic, wonderful experience he'd been unconsciously avoiding his entire life because it felt too messy and uncontrolled. Sarah watched him with guarded eyes. After dinner she told the twins it was bath time, and they needed to say goodbye to their visitor. Emma hugged Marcus's leg with surprising strength. "You're nice," she declared. "You can come back and visit Captain Bubbles again." James was more reserved, but offered Marcus his wooden sword to hold for a moment, which Sarah later explained was a significant honor. Marcus stood in the small apartment holding a wooden sword, while Sarah herded the twins toward the bathroom. Then he was alone in the living room, surrounded by evidence of lives he hadn't known existed. He looked at crayon drawings on the walls, toys scattered across the floor, books piled everywhere,
photos of Sarah and the twins at parks and beaches and the library. He picked up a frame showing Emma and James on their birthday, chocolate cake smeared on their faces, Sarah between them laughing. They looked happy, poor, and struggling, and exhausted but genuinely happy. Marcus realized with sudden clarity that Sarah had built something beautiful here, something that had nothing to do with money or success or the things he'd spent 15 years chasing. She'd built a home. When Sarah returned, she found him still standing in the middle of the living room looking lost. He set down the photo frame carefully. "I want to be part of their lives," he said. "I know I have no right to ask after 5 years. I know you have every reason to say no, but I'm asking anyway." Sarah studied him for a long moment. Her expression cycled through emotions he couldn't name. Finally she spoke with careful precision. "This isn't about what you want, Marcus, it's about what's best for Emma and James."
3 months later, Marcus Chen stood in a playground near Green Lake pushing his daughter on a swing, while his son waited impatiently for his turn. Emma shouted higher, higher with complete faith that her father would catch her if she fell. James had already informed him 3 times that he could swing higher than Emma, even though this was demonstrably untrue. Sarah sat on a bench 20 feet away pretending to read a book while actually watching them with hawk-like intensity, ready to intervene if Marcus proved to be the disaster father she'd feared. The arrangement they'd worked out was complicated and fragile. Marcus visited twice a week under Sarah's supervision. He'd cleared his Tuesday and Thursday evenings permanently from his schedule, something his executive team was still adjusting to with varying degrees of shock. He brought groceries. He read bedtime stories with Emma correcting his character voices, and James falling asleep against his shoulder. He learned that Emma was fearless and dramatic while James was cautious and thoughtful. He discovered that fatherhood was simultaneously harder and more rewarding than any business challenge he'd ever faced. The money conversation had been brutal. Marcus had wanted to pay off Sarah's debts immediately, buy her a house, set up trust funds for the twins. Sarah had refused with steel in her voice. She'd accepted a reasonable child support payment that she'd calculated based on state guidelines, and told him that anything beyond that would have to wait until they established whether he was actually committed to being a father, or just assuaging his guilt with money. The custody arrangement was informal and based entirely on trust, which made Marcus's lawyers nervous, but Sarah had been clear. If he wanted a relationship with Emma and James, it would be built slowly on his time and effort, not purchased with legal filings and court orders. If he proved himself, she'd consider formalizing things. If he disappeared or hurt the twins emotionally, she'd make sure he never got another chance. Marcus had agreed to her terms. His mother had moved to Seattle and rented an apartment 3 blocks from Sarah's place. Catherine Chen had met her grandchildren and promptly declared them perfect, while making pointed comments about Marcus finally getting his priorities straight. She babysat on weekends and reported back to Marcus on the twins' activities with the thoroughness of a military intelligence officer. The business implications had been significant. Marcus had restructured Chen Technologies' executive team, delegated responsibilities he'd been hoarding for years, and cut his work hours to something approaching reasonable. The board had concerns. Several major investors questioned his commitment. One article in TechCrunch speculated about his declining focus. Marcus had stood in a board meeting and told them all that he'd spent 15 years building a company and 0 years building a family, and he was done apologizing for wanting both. James tugged on his sleeve. "It's my turn now, and also I'm hungry. Can we get the ice cream from the truck?" Marcus looked at Sarah. She was trying to hide a smile. The ice cream truck appeared at this park every Saturday at 10:30, and James had clearly been planning this negotiation all morning. Sarah nodded slightly, and Marcus felt absurdly proud that he'd apparently passed some invisible test. At the ice cream truck, Emma got chocolate with rainbow sprinkles and James got vanilla with gummy bears, and Marcus got nothing, because he was too busy making sure neither twin dropped their cone. They sat on the grass in the sunshine, and Emma told him an elaborate story about her preschool friend, who had a pet rabbit. James demonstrated his ability to lick ice cream in a spiral pattern. Sarah joined them eventually, and Marcus handed her the coffee he'd bought from a cart near the parking lot, remembering without being told that she took it with oat milk and 1 sugar. Small things, that's what fatherhood was turning out to be. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but small accumulated moments that added up to something bigger. Remembering that Emma needed her stuffed elephant to sleep,
knowing that James was afraid of the dark but too proud to admit it, learning that both twins inherited his stubborn streak and Sarah's creativity, which meant they were going to be either brilliant or impossible, or probably both. The conversation about telling them the truth was approaching. Emma had started asking questions about why Marcus visited so much. James had announced that Marcus seemed like a dad-type person, and did he have kids of his own somewhere? Sarah said they needed to have the conversation soon before the twins figured it out themselves. Marcus was terrified. That evening, after returning the twins to Sarah's apartment, Marcus drove to his penthouse and stood in the middle of his living room, looking at the space with new eyes, the minimalist furniture, the art that had been selected by a decorator, the kitchen he never used, the second bedroom that served as storage for files he'd never reference. This wasn't a home, it was a showroom, a monument to success that felt hollow and cold compared to Sarah's chaotic, cluttered apartment, where every surface held evidence of love. His phone rang. Linda calling about a crisis with the Tokyo office. Marcus listened to her explain the situation and realized he didn't care about it the way he used to. The urgency that would have sent him racing to fix things immediately felt distant and unimportant compared to the fact that he'd just spent 3 hours with his children. He told Linda to handle it, told her she had full authority to make whatever decisions were necessary. She paused, clearly surprised, then said she'd take care of it. After hanging up, Marcus opened his laptop and started researching 4-bedroom houses in neighborhoods with good schools, started looking at family cars instead of luxury sports vehicles, started imagining a future that looked nothing like the one he'd been building for 15 years. His mother's words echoed in his head. You can be angry at Sarah for keeping this secret, or you can ask yourself what kind of father you want to be now. Marcus was choosing the second option. It wouldn't be easy. Sarah still watched him with guarded eyes, waiting for him to revert to his old patterns. The twins were wonderful and exhausting, and raised 1,000 questions he had no idea how to answer. His business required constant attention even with delegation. The learning curve for fatherhood was steep, and he was climbing it without a safety net. But when Emma had hugged him goodbye that evening, and whispered that she was glad he came to visit, Marcus had felt something click into place. Purpose. Real purpose beyond quarterly earnings and market share. The kind of success that couldn't be measured in Forbes rankings or stock prices. He thought about the collision on 5th and Pike that had started this entire journey. Thought about how a spilled cup of coffee had revealed a truth that changed everything. Thought about Sarah's face when she'd seen him, the fear and panic, and something else underneath that he was only now beginning to understand. Hope, maybe, that he'd be different than she expected, that he'd prove her wrong about the kind of father he'd become. Marcus looked out at the Seattle skyline and made himself a promise. He would prove her wrong, would show up every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, would learn to braid Emma's hair and build block towers with James, would be present and available, and actually there in all the ways he'd failed to be during his marriage, would earn his place in their lives one small moment at a time, until Sarah stopped watching him with guarded eyes, and the twins stopped calling him the visitor, and started calling him Dad. It wouldn't fix the 5 years he'd missed, wouldn't erase Sarah's struggle or the loneliness she'd endured raising their children alone, but it was a start, a beginning built on honest recognition of his failures, and genuine commitment to being better. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years becoming a successful CEO, now he was going to spend however long it took becoming a decent father. The city lights sparkled below, as evening settled over Seattle. Somewhere across town his children were probably in bed by now, Sarah reading them stories in the small apartment they called home. Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant the park near Green Lake. Emma wanted to bring bread for the ducks. James wanted to show Marcus his new superhero cape. Sarah would watch from the bench with her book and her careful vigilance, and Marcus would be there, not because he had to be, not because lawyers or custody agreements compelled him, but because those small, chaotic, wonderful moments with his children had become the most important thing in his life. That was the real story, not a CEO discovering he had secret children, not a dramatic custody battle or a romance rekindling, just a man learning slowly and imperfectly to be the father his children deserved, just small steps forward, just showing up, just being there, just love in its most ordinary and extraordinary form.